Okay, it's now 10, so we will go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Gabriella, and I am NCCASA's Training Communications Specialist. During this webinar, please feel free to utilize the chat and Q&A box. Both I and Christy will be monitoring those throughout the webinar. I'd like to introduce our presenter for Upstream, Same River, Rethinking the Bones of Our System. Christy Croft is NCCASA's Prevention Program Education Manager, and they will be guiding us through this information. Christy, thanks for being here.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. I know it's an honor that you gave some of your time to us to NCCASA and some of our work and some of our trainings and some of these thoughts around moving beyond upstream prevention into really interrogating our systems themselves. I can tell you a little bit about our agency. The North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault is an inclusive statewide alliance working to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. And our framework is a social justice framework. So we do all of our work from a strong intersectional social justice perspective. We know that by centering our work around marginalized communities, everybody gets served. And in that vein, we organize and sponsor statewide training, support rape crisis programs. We provide resource sharing and technical assistance to all of North Carolina's rape crisis centers. We work on legislative agendas and policy change at the local and national level. We are very much involved in the anti-human trafficking movement. We also do prevention education and a lot of campus-based work. You're hearing us today, if you are not one of our member agencies, because we've been opening up our trainings during COVID to anyone who wants to register. So that should be continuing a little bit longer, but we're excited to have some of you joining. If you are not in North Carolina, welcome. We want to acknowledge at the start that not all women are victims, not all men are perpetrators, and that anyone of any gender can be a victim or a perpetrator. Our webinar today is Upstream, Same River, Rethinking the Bones of Our Systems. And I want to just let everybody know with some tech things. If you go up, you can engage in the chat box by clicking on chat. If you go to participants, I believe there's a way you can raise your hand also. And so I see someone has their hand raised, and I'm not sure if there's a question yet, but if there is, you can throw it in the chat box. And feel free, I love a really engaged webinar or training. If you've ever attended any of my in-person trainings, one of the things I love is when people respond to questions and ask questions of their own and get engaged in the material. So I know that's really hard to replicate in a webinar, and also I want to encourage you to engage with the material and stay involved in what we're talking about. Everybody's muted right now. You can raise your hand, and I want to give a content note that we're going to be obviously talking about sexual violence. We're going to be talking about racism and systemic racism, and some parts of this webinar may feel overwhelming, especially right now with everything that's going on in the world. So I want to encourage you to take care of yourself in the best way that you can during this webinar, and that might look like stepping away for a moment, maybe taking the earbuds out to take a second for some deep breathing, whatever it is that helps you regroup and reconnect when you need to feel empowered to take care of yourself. We're going to go over a concept review around the social ecological model, some risk and protective factors, use some basic prevention work. We're going to talk a little bit about history, harm, and harm reduction and how that works. And then we're going to talk some about the groundwater approach and what that means before shifting into questions and closing. I want to start by offering just an invocation, a moment for us to kind of situate ourselves in this work and in this moment and in this webinar. And so I want to encourage you to take a pause before we dive in and remember your ancestors and where they were in this history. If you're not in the U.S., some of this might not be as applicable, but if you are and you're not first generation here, when did your ancestors come to this country? We're going to talk today about race, about slavery, about oppression, and about harm. And all of us here today are living in a society that holds the imprints of its histories. That's obvious just from looking around at the news, at current events, at how people are treated and how they behave. And all of us who have ancestors who've been here more than a generation or two may have caused harm or oppressed others or benefited from the oppression of others. At some point, some of our ancestors may have experienced harm or hardship, been enslaved and abused, or struggled to survive under the weight of systemic and structural oppression. And each of us in the U.S. today live with the consequences of that history. Depending on our positionality and where we are in this story, we may benefit from that history, or we might still be bearing its violence. So I wanted to start this webinar. It's important to me to start this webinar by grounding us in the reality of how each of us is situated in that history. No matter who our ancestors are, what we talk about today is going to be hard to hear. For those of you on the webinar today who have ancestors who experienced enslavement, racist violence, societal abuse, or other forms of oppression, you are the living legacy of your ancestors' determination and brilliance. And for those on the webinar today who have ancestors who participated in the enslavement and oppression of others, you honor their memory not by continuing to perpetuate the same kinds of harm, but by making the repairs they wouldn't or couldn't. So thank you for being part of the dialogue. A little bit about me. My name is Christy. My pronouns are they, them. I am the Prevention Education Program Manager at the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and before that I was our Anti-Human Trafficking Specialist. I want to start by sharing that our identities shape our lens. Our lived experience shapes how we learn about the world, and I am a white person. This isn't my only identity, and it doesn't capture all my lived experiences, but it's important for me to acknowledge at the start of this webinar. This webinar was originally conceived as a workshop to help people who have more privilege understand how this country's history of oppression impacts the systems that we work within. So for many of you who live with that oppression every day, you're already going to know and probably feel in your body a lot of this. And for many of us who live with privilege, a lot of what we talk about today might be especially challenging. I want to invite you to keep an open mind and a willingness to learn, and because of my own identities, which are, of course, like all of us, the lens through which I see the world, I might get some of this wrong, and if that happens, I invite you to reach out and let me know, because I'm always wanting to do better, and my email address is there. I'm going to pause for a moment and just check my chat box and see who all we have here. I'm excited to scroll through. Welcome. I'm seeing some familiar names. Excited to see some people I know and some I call friends and colleagues, and excited to see new names. I think this is the first time I've ever done a webinar with someone who wasn't in the U.S., so that's exciting. Cool. All right. So if y'all have any questions, definitely throw them in there in the chat box for me. I'm going to start by just asking you, in the chat box, we've had a good time getting some introductions in there, and it's neat to see where everyone's coming from, but maybe some thought around who are your stakeholders. So if you want to put in the chat box, when you think of who your stakeholders are, your community partners, your stakeholders, whoever you're accountable to, who are the people that come to mind for you? Okay, so far I'm seeing survivors, other nonprofits, secondary survivors, and Gabriella, when we do Q&A, if there's any of those chat that you see that I'm missing, feel free to kind of read those out with me and help me. Anyone else? Who do you think of as your stakeholders?
Media professionals, schools, donors, community, fellow agencies, my entire community, our stakeholders, government, law enforcement, churches, families, youth organizations, Department of Health and Human Resources, board members, clients, coworkers. A lot of community.
Yes, I'm seeing a lot of community, I'm seeing a lot of families, I'm seeing youth. These are all exciting. I'm also seeing, obviously, no matter how much we are engaged in our work through an, organizing or activism or advocacy kind of lens, we are, most of us, working at nonprofits, so a lot of times other agencies are our community partners and stakeholders too. But I'm excited to see a lot of things in the responses that are showing some solidarity and a focus on the people that you're here to support. We're going to revisit this at the end and try to expand and broaden our thinking around who our stakeholders are. And I also want to tell you, before we get too heavy into this webinar, that in order to end any form of violence, we are going to have to be brave, and that's going to mean questioning accepted norms, challenging systems, and being more honest with each other in this space, and then taking that honesty back as we're able into our work than we might be used to. I know a lot of times people come to webinars hoping for a new tool. I need a new screening tool. I need a new checklist. I need a new, a new document that will help me that I can incorporate into my work. And we do need our tools to tell us what to do, but our frameworks inform how we do our tools, right? The tools tell us what to do. The frameworks tell us how to do it. And I don't believe we can end violence without a solid anti-oppression framework. So in addition to needing tools, we also need new frameworks, and this webinar is going to be more about shifting frameworks and helping you get some ideas for rebuilding those than it is just about another tool. So some prevention concept review. So this is a social ecological model. And the way the social ecological model works is we have in any form of violence prevention what we call risk factors and what we call protective factors. Risk factors increase the likelihood of violence occurring even if they're not causal, and protective factors decrease the likelihood of violence occurring, or they can increase someone's resilience and ability to heal from their violence that they've experienced if they do experience it. What's important for us to remember is that risk factor doesn't just mean it increases the likelihood of you experiencing violence. Risk factors increase the likelihood of perpetrating violence too. Same with protective factors. Protective factors prevent or reduce the likelihood of experiencing violence, but also of perpetrating violence. And in many communities, when we start to dig into this, those same risk and protective factors that impact the likelihood of someone experiencing violence, they're the same risk and protective factors that impact the likelihood of someone perpetrating violence or causing harm. And so when we pull back and use this social ecological model as our prevention lens, we are not just trying to target people from being harmed or experiencing violence, we're also looking at preventing the harm before it ever happens. And that's what we mean when you hear us say primary prevention. Primary prevention means preventing the violence before it's ever occurred. And in order for us to do that, we need to prevent the perpetration of violence before it's ever occurred. So as you consider risk and protective factors and how that plays out in your work that you're doing with prevention, whatever form of violence you're working primarily in, remember that we're focused on ending the perpetration of violence, not just the experience of it. Risk and protective factors exist at each level of this social ecological model. So we have individual level risk and protective factors, relationship level ones, community level ones, society level ones. And because these risk and protective factors exist at every single level of the social ecological model, our prevention needs to be considering how to impact those risk and protective factors at every level. A lot of times when people are new to violence prevention or maybe don't have a solid background in it, when they think about prevention, they immediately jump to those individual and relationship level factors. How can we teach someone to make safer choices? How can we teach someone about harm happens? And sometimes we end up inadvertently running into victim blaming in the way we talk about individual and relationship level prevention. when we're not pulling back. And so when we pull back at community, what is it in this community that makes violence likely to occur? What is it in this society that normalizes violence, especially against certain populations? When we pull back and look at the whole social ecological model, we can start having more effective and comprehensive prevention programming. And you'll also hear a lot about the social determinants of health. The social determinants of health is just a way of acknowledging that a lot of the things that determine someone's health outcomes, which include their exposure to violence, are out of their individual control. This was an effort to kind of shift some of the focus to those community and society level issues, such as access to health care and general community health, the social and community context in which they live. Education, how much access to education do they have, and how well supported is that education? Economic stability and neighborhood and built environment. So this is basically the built environment in which people live and work and learn and play. You'll hear a lot of talk in violence prevention about downstream and upstream. And so the idea with downstream is that you're treating symptoms, you're addressing harm after it has happened. Where this metaphor comes from is if you imagine that you are enjoying a nice day at the river and you're noticing that the day is lovely, everything's nice warm day, you're at the river because you can't be indoors with anyone because COVID, and all of a sudden you see someone floating down the river and they're struggling and you're afraid they're going to drown, and you jump in and you help pull them out, and then someone else falls in and you pull them out. And pretty soon, more and more people are falling in, and you're doing a great job of pulling them out, but you sure are getting tired because it's a lot of work dragging people out of the river. And so maybe you decide that instead of just pulling people out, you want to head upstream and see why are they falling into the river so you can fix it. Maybe there's a broken bridge. Maybe there's a place where there's a cliff that you don't notice till it's too late, but you go try to find the reason and fix the reason why they're falling in so you don't have to keep pulling them out. So downstream approaches to violence prevention are treatment of symptoms and addressing harm after it has happened. Midstream, where you're starting to move upstream, you're modifying individual behaviors to help individuals learn how to take care of themselves and avoid causing harm and make good choices about their health. Upstream is where you're addressing the social determinants of health, conditions in which people are born and grow and live and work and play. So in violence prevention work, and a lot of the work that we do with sexual violence, which is our focus, downstream and midstream work might look like outreach, reaching out to survivors to try to connect them to services, hotline work, support groups, shelter, therapy programs, awareness events, maybe even implementing some curricula that focus on individual and relationship level risk and protective factors. And these are all really wonderful and essential things that we are doing and that we should be doing. When we move into upstream violence prevention, a lot of times we are looking at curricula or strategies that incorporate community and society level risk and protective factors. Working on your agency's internal equity could be considered upstream because you're working on like the lens through which you're working on your violence prevention. Working on your agency's policies, protocols, and services to increase equity and access so that all people, even those from marginalized communities that maybe your agencies have struggled to serve in the past, can find your services to be meaningful and relevant. We do upstream work when we have really challenging conversations within our agency, when we do community engagement, and when we bring up all of these issues with our stakeholders. Did y'all have any questions on this concept review before we move on? So social ecological model, risk and protective factors, upstream, downstream. Any questions? Okay, well, if there are questions, we'll get to them as they arrive. So we talk about this whole public health model, social determinants of health, and what upstream prevention looks like, but honestly, sometimes in that discussion, we forget to talk about, like, how did we get here in the first place, right? how did we end up with these conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and play? Where did that come from? And that means we have to take a look at history and how harm happens and how harm got embedded into some of our systems and how we can use a harm reduction approach in our work. So, history of the United States, when we're looking especially at sexual violence, and also y'all know a lot of my work has been around human trafficking as well, and so this history impacts those forms of violence and many others. But this country started with genocide and enslavement of people from native cultures, and during that time period there was sexual servitude, there was rape as a form of violence and a technique of war. There was the transatlantic slave trade from the 1500s to the 1800s, and we all know that sexual violence played a big part in that, was just an essential element of it. Chattel slavery until 1865, and that was when the model of chattel slavery that we're familiar with ended. But what happened then? So chattel slavery ends, it's no longer legal, and racism just went away and everybody lived equally and happily ever after. That is a lie. That's not true. So where did racism go? Hit me in the chat box. What did we see happen? And we're seeing Jim Crow laws, prisons and jails, segregation, prison industrial complex, redlining, unequal schools. I see you guys have been to this kind of webinar before. Transform into other systems like the carceral system, slave patrols, which we know were the precursor to modern policing in the South. Arresting Black people for petty crimes and re-enslaving them as criminals. Right, because if you could only be enslaved, you could not be enslaved except in the case of as punishment for crime. So we have to create a criminal structure and criminal laws that keep that workforce in there. Voter suppression, the drug war. I'm so glad someone brought up the drug war. White supremacy and the KKK during Reconstruction and thereafter. Housing inequality, prison labor. So racism didn't just go away. Those things are carrying forward. So what abolitionists and people who were fighting slavery started during this history carries itself forward in the legacy of people who are fighting all of these things that y'all are putting in the chat box right now. So racism didn't go away. And all of these things, the ones that are listed on this slide and the ones that y'all listed in the chat box, we know that the history of sexual violence is entwined with the history of racism, but it's also important because the systems we use to respond to sexual violence and other forms of violence, those systems are also entwined with this history of racism and oppression, which makes it really tricky for us to have those as our primary tools and systems to work within in order to try to ease or prevent harm. It's a very confusing place to be in for someone who's been studying on this history. And why does our history matter? I just kind of want to talk about that because I'm sure if you are like me and have a social media account or a relative of any sort, any family member will do, you've probably heard someone at some point in your life say, that was all in the past, why don't we just get over it, right? And I want you to think for just a minute about your own childhood. Don't go too dark, but just think for a minute about what places you felt safe in and what places you felt uncomfortable in. And I want you to think about the people you liked being around and people you didn't like, people who confused you. Think about what coping strategies you developed to navigate uncomfortable feelings, how you responded to people who silenced you or gave you a hard time. Do those patterns from your childhood still influence how you respond to people today? If you have a spouse or partner you want to bring in the room to answer for you, I'll give you a second to drag them in. But of course they do. They impact how we respond to people and relationships. They impact how we respond to conflict. They impact how we respond to confusion and how we respond to fear. And so our history totally matters today. And while sociology, which is looking at those patterns on the level of the group or society instead of an individual, it doesn't always look exactly like psychology, but there's still a lot of overlap looking at these patterns on the individual and society level. So our country had trauma, so much trauma involved in its founding. There were people living on this land before Europeans came who went through a lot of trauma as the result of the colonies and founding of the U.S. And while plenty of Europeans came here for promises of resources and gain, plenty also came here fleeing trauma themselves or encountered traumas as part of settlement. And the transatlantic slave trade and system of chattel slavery also inflicted trauma. And our country developed systems and patterns out of that trauma to try to enact some sort of control over the trauma that was going on. And just because the Civil War effectively ended legalized chattel slavery in this country doesn't mean that the trauma didn't keep creating new patterns that impact us still today in the form of all these things that y'all are listing in the chat box, which now include things like being embedded into the minds of the young by older adults. We are passing this down to our children, y'all. I want to mention at this point, there's a really good book that I've actually loved for a few years now, but I've seen in the last few months it being recommended a ton, so y'all may have already heard about it. So it's a book called My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. It's by Resmaa Menakem, and it's a really cool book because Resmaa is a somatic therapist who is amazing, a somatic therapist with a focus on trauma. And this book gives you not just for Black people in the U.S. today, but also for white people. And he even does a lot of work around cops and trauma, around police and the trauma that they experience, both in the form of their work and in the form of narratives that get handed down in policing and become part of that harmful culture without you being aware of it. And what I love about this book is it keeps you grounded in the body and in your own lived experience and your own ancestry and your own narratives, and gives you activities and questions at the end of each chapter that keep you engaged in how this work, this story, this trauma impacts you. It's called My Grandmother's Hands, and maybe Gabriella can post you a link into the chat box. There we go. Perfect. It's a great book. It really is a very interesting book, and I love it. And the author also does a racialized trauma online course that he has made free since the uprisings got started. So moving back to this history that we talked about earlier, another piece that I want to get y'all thinking about, in addition to this history, just a few more questions to kind of layer on top of that, right? I want you to think about, how does civilizing people into cultural norms, such as behavior, dress, speech, influence this history? How does this impact how our systems view survivors? And how does this impact what kinds of behaviors are criminalized? So we know that a lot of the power during the time when criminal codes were being created, when these systems to respond to what they understood to be bad behavior, unacceptable behavior, a lot of the power that was being used to create these frameworks was in the hands of people who already had power, who were white, middle and upper class people, right? So there are places where if you kind of look at what we criminalize in this country, where some of it's very clearly just undeniable harm and violence against another person. And there's some places where you're seeing nuisance behavior and crimes about people not behaving according to a certain set of constructed cultural norms. And that does impact how our systems view survivors. Any of you who have ever had a survivor who has gone through some terrible victim blaming around their own behavior not meeting a certain standard, or them not being a perfect enough victim, you know that this history created a series of expectations around how to be a civilized person that impact not only how our systems view the survivors we're here to support, but also on how we constructed what a crime is in the first place, right? So that makes us really tricky when we are navigating survivors, and we want to minimize the impact of those norms around civilization that came out of this racist history on our survivors, but we also don't want to support those norms being used to create a criminal code that isn't, that comes with disparate outcomes and disproportionate impacts on certain people. Yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. So what is structural racism? So the full definition that I found that I thought made sense to me was structural racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. Structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economical, and political systems in which we all exist. And I know that's hard to hear because I'm just as much a part of some of these systems as y'all are. So I want to just pause for a moment and acknowledge that we're going to get into some tricky parts where we're talking pretty heavily about systems that are modern day systems that we may be part of. You may work in one of those systems or collaborate closely with one of them. So here's the part where we all recognize that the only way we can end racism is by challenging ourselves and our own behavior and give ourselves a hard look. And we don't have time here on this webinar for a huge lesson on structural racism, but I did think this definition was helpful. Those of us doing anti-racism work today realize that racism, it didn't just disappear after the civil rights movement. You know, we're done. It didn't disappear when Obama got elected. It tends to get embedded in the systems we have all around us, and those are systems that were never set up to protect people with marginalized identities in the first place, but to exclude them. And now we're trying to be not racist while still using these systems or try to fix those systems so that they're not racist anymore. And those of you who feel like this is a newer concept for you or one you don't have the strongest grasp on, or maybe you've not done a lot of study about it and it doesn't seem like it's making sense to you now, I'd want to encourage you to take a racial equity training just to learn some more about what we mean when we're talking about structural racism. And then after you've done like a more in-depth training, a full day, a 2-day, where you've really dug into it, or a college course, then sit with it and kind of see how you want to unpack it and what it means for you in your own life. So what are some examples of structural racism?
We have standardized testing in school, wage gaps, healthcare access, school to prison pipeline, great example. The legal system, yeah, definitely a lost school to prison pipeline, totally true. Sex abuse to prison pipeline, voting practices, what we criminalize, severe lack of diversity in government, food deserts, redlining, environmental injustice, access to education, recruiting practices to companies and law firms, maternal and infant mortality inequity, higher education, sex trafficking of Black and Native girls and women, neighborhood makeup, Band-Aids.
I'm really glad to see the things y'all are bringing up in there. I'm sad that they happen, but I'm seeing that y'all are definitely thinking about this stuff. Broken windows practice in policing. White male boardrooms. I saw school to prison pipeline, and I saw sexual abuse to prison pipeline, and I think we can pull that back even farther and say trauma to prison pipeline, right? Like a lot of what we end up seeing is a lot of times when people experience high levels of trauma, whether it's individual trauma or cultural trauma or historical trauma, a lot of times what people with trauma, any of you who've worked with a survivor of intense trauma knows that there are sometimes behaviors that are challenging, and sometimes those get criminalized. And so the trauma to prison pipeline, I want to just name that someone mentioned in the chat box. I want to lift this up. This question is hard to answer for an African American. We live with this every day in every form of our lives. And I want to just acknowledge that and sit with the truth of that for a moment. That, yeah, it's a thing where living with it every day, I would imagine you see it all the time. One of the things that I've noticed in doing this kind of work and having these conversations with white people is that sometimes it's hard for white people to answer too, because they don't even see it. Sometimes we are conditioned to just think this is the way things are, And so part of why I try to do webinars like this is especially when I get a chance to have access to white people who are in helping professions to help them see this really clearly. Cultural assimilation, legacy admissions to top historically white universities, gentrification, over-policing of Black communities. I want to note, too, that Amber brought up the difference between the war on drugs versus the opioid epidemic, right? There's definitely a racialization of how in both cases, we're seeing that the problem is drugs, but depending on who we're thinking is most impacted, that racism impacts whether we think we need to wage war or call it a public health epidemic and have a health response. Generally, criminalization. Good call. Good call, Erin. So these are all good examples of structural racism. And for those of you who maybe some of those things we brought up were new to you, I'm going to lay out a couple of examples for you, just so that we can make sure we're all pretty clear on what we mean with some of these. So this first map is a 1937, I think, Homeowners Loan Corporation map of Durham. And this is to kind of tell you about what we call redlining. If you've never heard of redlining, what that means is that in 1937 Durham, as home lending organizations were looking at who was a good risk and who was a bad risk, they intentionally made decisions and drew maps that laid it out pretty explicitly about which communities they were willing to offer loans, home improvement loans, mortgage loans to help them improve and build up their communities, and which ones they considered, quote, high risk and would not invest in. And race played a key role in the development of these maps. And so what happens is when we see communities that are having resources poured into them, those resources, those communities flourish, right? When we have communities that are historically and intentionally deprived of resources and funds to improve their communities and their homes, we see that those communities start to struggle. And so a lot of times, maybe some of us grew up, especially if you're white, you might have grown up knowing which neighborhood was a good neighborhood and which neighborhood was the bad side of town. And we just thought that's how it was. You have no idea that this was a systemically created disparity that was created through a practice called redlining. And so that's one example of structural racism, is pouring resources into some communities, depriving it from other communities, and then saying, look at how this is. Like, you can just look around and see what's safe and what's not, and not realizing it was all made to be that way. This one is gerrymandering. This is where we draw districts to try to make sure that there is no district in which white people do not dominate the voting block in that area, where you try to like change the district in order to secure the outcome that you want in elections. Another one is lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. If you look at this statistic, 1 in 9 of all men have a lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. But if you break it down by race, 1 in 17 white men have a lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. 1 in 6 Latino men have a lifetime likelihood of imprisonment, and 1 in 3 Black men do. And I want you to think about the things we've talked about how civilizing and criminal codes were created out of these racist constructs. I want you to look at things like redlining. When people are in communities that they are not having access, whether it's through employment discrimination, redlining, when they don't have access, they turn to underground economies to try to survive and take care of themselves and their families. And so there is criminalization of people at disparate levels, both by race, but also by virtue of this map that you see there. This was all intentional and has created the outcomes that we've seen. And it's part of our systems. I'm going to check the chat box real quick. Oh, yep, okay. So someone has a good comment that says, when thinking through this, it's easy to get pulled into thinking about challenges related to socioeconomic status. And I think disparate representation of people of color in lower socioeconomic status is a form of structural racism, but the eclipsing of racism when thinking about socioeconomic challenges is a way that white supremacy perpetuates itself. Thank you for calling that out, for bringing that up. A lot of times we do see socioeconomic status, and a lot of times that socioeconomic status is created by things like this homeowners lending map that we see of Durham, and we forget that that map was drawn. The socioeconomic disparities were in large part created based on race. And also, if you dig back into the history of chattel slavery, it was a tactic of the wealthy elite to try to get poor white people engaged intentionally in roles such as you know, assistants, to try to make it beneficial for them to align more with the people in power than with the people who were being enslaved. So those socioeconomic practices are also very much rooted in and soaked in race, and race is the underlying factor throughout. And then also money bail. Money bond is one of those things where a lot of the people who are sitting in prisons are in prisons or in jails because they can't pay the bond to get out. They're not even convicted of anything yet. We have people sitting in prison or in jail awaiting trial that may take a really long time because they can't just drop the money to get out when they need to until their trial comes. Again, that ties into this racial history, but it also then causes more harm when we've got people who are losing job days. They're losing jobs because they're stuck and can't afford cash bail. They are abandoning their children, not by choice. They're being taken from their children who need families. There's so many more impacts on culture and community and society when we have a cash bail system. So these are all just a few examples of what we mean when we say structural racism. And especially with the cash bail, when we remember our talk earlier about what is criminalized and what isn't, we know that there's disparate aspects by race, or different impacts by race. So this chart, if you imagine that line in the middle being someone's timeline of their life, and they are born where that line starts on the left, and maybe they show up in your office where that line ends on the right, however they come into your office, and maybe they lived in poverty their whole life. From the time that they were young, they might have had domestic violence or partner violence in the home, maybe substance abuse in their home. They might have experienced abuse or neglect, had an incarcerated or absent parent, substance use disorder, and a lot of these are related to adverse childhood experiences. So it's important, whatever form of violence that you work in, when someone comes into your office, to remember that there are all of these other things that they may have experienced. And a lot of these are due to race and systemic oppression. And also some of these bars might even be racism. That would be one that's the experience of oppression, the experience of living as a person of color under racism, the experience of living as a queer person in a homophobic or transphobic society, the experience of living as a woman under patriarchy. Those are all trauma. Like, it causes trauma responses in your body based on just living under this cultural system. So it's very easy for us to want to segregate when someone comes into our office and try to pick out the one piece that we're there to deal with. And when we do so, sometimes we fail to see the whole person and what they've experienced in their whole life. I always tease, I've done the human trafficking work, but I sometimes tease human trafficking people who do this work because they get a survivor and they're like, I'm going to fix your trafficking for you. When in reality, when I've talked to survivors of trafficking, a lot of times that's not even the worst thing that's ever happened to them. They don't want to talk about their trafficking experience. They want to talk about their childhood, or the parent that they don't think loved them, or whether or not they'll ever have a boyfriend that's a healthy relationship. So sometimes we get a little myopic about that. And not only does that cause us to not see the whole person in front of us, but it causes us to fail to situate that person's entirety of their many experiences of trauma into a cultural context that did this to them. We get so focused on the individual and their individual trauma that we fail to see what they're dealing with in their community and neighborhood. There are some studies of some neighborhoods that show that in these particular neighborhoods, and again, go back to that redlining map, in some neighborhoods, every child in that neighborhood has a high ACE score. This is unacceptable, right? And it's not unacceptable because that community is inherently bad. It's unacceptable because we created this. This is our system. Thinking this way has to have impacts. It does have impacts, and they're negative right now, but it needs to have positive impacts. We need to take this kind of thing into consideration in our policy work, in our prevention work, and in the way we respond to survivors. There's an article I love called The Future of Healing, Shifting from Trauma-Informed Care to Healing-Centered Engagement. And I don't agree with all of it because they seem to be like, we don't need trauma-informed care, we need healing-centered engagement. And I love my trauma-informed care, but I think we need both. But I did learn a lot from this article, and I want to share with you what healing-centered engagement starts to nudge us toward. So while the term, here's some quotes from it, while the term trauma-informed care is important, it is incomplete. First, trauma-informed care correctly highlights the specific needs for individual young people who have exposure to trauma. However, current formulations of trauma-informed care presumes that the trauma is an individual experience rather than a collective one. Second, trauma-informed care requires that we treat trauma in people, but provides very little insight into how we might address the root causes of trauma in neighborhoods, families, and schools. So this is one of those things to where if what you're doing is working with people one-on-one on their trauma, or working to focus on preventing the individual from experiencing trauma, you're missing the bigger picture that there are root causes of trauma in neighborhoods, families, and schools that aren't about individuals. Those of you who work under a CDC-funded grant know that the CDC is starting to be aware of this and has been encouraging all of us doing prevention work to move into those community and society level prevention strategies. So we talked a little about what examples of structural racism are, but we're going to look a little at what are some ways harm gets embedded in our systems. And I'm going to just throw a few out here. Y'all can add more in the chat box. I'm going to start working through the ones I have on the slide, and then we'll bring in some more. Actually, I'm going to pause before we do that because I do see some rich stuff happening in the chat box that I want to look at. Someone brought up another thing they just thought of, racism embedded within the tech industry with algorithms, artificial intelligence. Tech is feeding you what you want to see. That is absolutely true. And also looking at facial recognition being an issue within that. Those of us who work with survivors. Yeah, some of it's going just to the panelists, by the way. So that's part of why I'm coming in to read some of this. So facial recognition, those of you who work with survivors and people who are there, I know what is it, duality, victim, defendant duality. Basically all that means to me, I grew up in rural North Carolina, or I was born in rural North Carolina. To me, that whole duality thing, that's just like none of us are all good or all bad, right? So those of you who work with people who are victims in some contexts and have caused harm in other contexts know that we need to be really thoughtful about things like facial recognition and how that might get misused. Someone's bringing up medical racism. Black women are believed to experience less pain. They are not believed or sent away without treatment. Absolutely, and that leads to worse outcomes. That then creates this belief that Black women have inherently worse outcomes when the reality is we have so much racism embedded in our culture and in the medical system that's creating the poor outcomes. I'm reminded of the wording I heard someone say, race isn't the risk factor, racism is. Being gay isn't the risk factor, homophobia is. Being trans isn't the risk factor, transphobia is. Being a woman isn't the risk factor, misogyny is. Like, it's important for us to remember these people aren't just inherently vulnerable. They're made vulnerable by cultures and systems. They aren't inherently marginalized. They're marginalized by society. Someone's bringing up unwarranted involvement with child protective services because white people don't approve of how Black people parent their children. I thank you for bringing that up. I attended a really great workshop last year by a lawyer from Bronx Defenders who was talking, her whole presentation was on child removal through social services as treatment for parents, who, because of their race, are not perceived to be a parent who's struggling with a substance use disorder and needs treatment and care. They are seen to be a bad parent who needs their kid removed. So thank you for naming that. Some other ones I'm going to bring into the dialogue here, and I'll come back to the chat box in a minute to see what I'm missing. Native erasure and harm, which a lot of times in our sexual violence and human trafficking work plays out with jurisdictional limitations, to where because of jurisdictions and the way that happens with reservations and the communities that surround them, there's often limitations that prevent them from equal access to systems. Structural racism and anti-Blackness play a role. And I mentioned anti-Blackness. That might be a new phrase for some of you. The reason we talk about anti-Blackness specifically are because racism takes on a lot of different forms, but not all people of color experience the racist legacy of chattel slavery. And so when we're talking about that specific form of racism, a lot of times we refer to that as anti-Blackness. A lot of times, if you've ever seen the acronym BIPOC, that stands for Black and Indigenous People of Color, and that's just to name the fact that Black and Native people experience a different form of racism frequently than is experienced by other people of color. Misogyny and rigid gender norms, structural oppression, poverty, disability, economic policy, all of these things contribute to layers of structural oppression that people experience. And these show up in our assumptions, in our language, and in our policies. And I want to name, since someone brought up economics earlier and how socioeconomic status is often perceived to be the risk factor, I just want to name intersectionality at this point, which is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, which goes to look at the fact that when you have multiple oppressed identities, you can't separate them out from each other. You get to experience all of these in every moment of your life. You are sitting at the intersection of multiple identities, and that often makes it hard for you to get support you need from some of your communities, because they may even be the ones holding judgment against some of your other communities and identities. When we look at poverty, disability, economic policy, it's important to remember these aren't separate issues. They're all intertwined, because they aren't experienced as separate issues by the people who are living under the weight of them. I'm going to look at the chat box again. When we were talking about what anti-Blackness means, someone mentioned our brown communities sometimes specifically wield anti-Black racism. That is true. Someone brought up harm getting embedded in our systems, even how we perceive someone as a good client versus a bad client. It may have racist roots. Perfect victims, poster children for services is getting brought up in here. Colorist, correct, even within brown and Black people, skin color has an impact on access and marginalization. Health disparities, access to healthy foods. Laws that are said to protect women but are actually limiting their rights and access to health care. That's a fun one. Taking care of children or women as if they are children is sometimes one of my pet peeves in some service programs. Someone mentioned that they often found advocates and staff were often more scared, in quotes, of Black survivors who were deemed aggressive. And someone mentioned thinking that equality equals equity. These are all really good pieces of this. Tokenizing, model minority. Yes. Thank y'all for bringing these into the dialogue. And systemic and structural harm impact our communities. They impact cultural disruption and sense of belonging. When we look at things in our history, such as residential schools for Native children, when we look at things like disparate rates of removal of children from parents of color, when we look at disparate impacts of incarceration among Black men, these disrupt communities and cultures and families and people's ability to have a sense of belonging. And then we turn around and note how that sense of belonging is not having a sense of belonging is one of the risk factors for sex trafficking or human trafficking or sexual violence, like it's some mystery how that happened in the first place. Economic stability is another thing that systemic and structural harm impact. Don't ever again talk about someone's low socioeconomic status being a risk factor for a specific form of violence without asking yourself, why are they not economically stable? How did that come about? What do we as a culture do? And what do we as a society fail to do for our people? Family norms, systemic and structural harm impact family norms. Y'all, I feel like, I should probably get some chamomile tea. I'm starting to get worked up with you. Y'all are definitely engaging, and that gets me fired up. Community-based responses and healing to all of the above. So all risk and protective factors for sexual violence, and I would add human trafficking, since I know that's what some of you on the webinar today do. All of our risk and protective factors are in some way touched or shaped by structural harm. And I'm going to throw in there immigration. I didn't put that on the slide. I might before the afternoon version of the webinar. Immigration policies impact all of this stuff too. We can't talk about preventing violence without looking at A, what are the root causes of that violence, and then B, how much are those root causes embedded in the systems we're leaning into to try to solve the problem, right? Once we become aware of that, how do we walk that tension? How do we carry that tension? How do we walk that complicated space, right? Because it doesn't solve the problem to be mad about it. We got to think about what we want to do. I'm going to bring up a groundwater approach. And so for me, the metaphor, this isn't exactly how REI explains it, but for me, we've talked about pulling people out of the river. We've talked about going upstream to fix them from falling in. But then we go back to our communities, and that river is still our water source. We are still drinking that water to hydrate ourselves, to take care of ourselves, to feel good about ourselves. What if that water's toxic in the first place? What if in our rush to pull people out of the river and fix bridges, none of us tested that water and figured out that we're all drinking garbage that is causing us to think that the way that our systems treat people is normal and just how it is, without being able to see how much of it's constructed out of our history. The groundwater approach from REI it highlights the fact that inequities are caused by systems regardless of people's culture or behavior. And that we have with all of these problems, and that includes our violence problems, we have a groundwater problem. And that's a lot of those of you who do sexual violence work, when we refer to rape culture, that's us pointing towards a groundwater problem, right? It also is the same with racism. Like, we need groundwater solutions. It is a cultural problem, not individual problems. And so starting from there, from the recognition that we have a groundwater problem, we can begin to unlock transformative change by looking for groundwater solutions. And that doesn't mean we can abandon everything that we do with our grants and our programs and our mission statements. We don't want to alienate our boards, and it does nobody any good if all of us go quit our jobs because we're like, we're done with systems, tear it down. We need to think really carefully and really smart about this to unlock some change. You have access, if you're on this webinar, you probably work in a position where you have access to systems other people don't have access to. That is a gift. That is what keeps me going in my job every day. So this article on Medium by Human Impact Partners, Nashira Baril, When Upstream Public Health Efforts Fall Short, is the blog post that I read that made me put this whole webinar together. And I encourage you to find it and check it out. But some quotes from it. One of them is single issue determinate interventions versus interconnected system of institutions working in concert yielding poor outcomes. If we get focused on our single issue interventions, we lose sight of interconnected systems that yield poor outcomes and how we can start to change those interconnected systems or replace them, let's be honest. When you're looking at a strategy or an approach that you're wanting to use in your work, ask yourself, does this strategy or approach see people as the problem, or does it have a structural lens? That doesn't mean that your strategy or approach can't see that people are impacted by the problem, that people are swimming in the problem, but you need to have that structural lens if you want to make change. The idea of I don't see color versus recognizing racism as a system of advantage. When people say I don't see color, whether they mean to or not, what they're saying is that they don't see the ways that race impacts the lives of Black and brown people every day. They're also saying they don't see the way that race confers them specifically with privilege in our U.S. culture. And yes, race is constructed. That's one of my favorite things when they're like, science says race isn't real anyway. Something being constructed doesn't mean it's not real, right? So something else that's constructed is language. Language is constructed out of our cultural context, but I'm not going to call Jade Palace today and order my takeout lunch in a series of like grunts and yells. Something can be constructed and still be real and impact our lives in meaningful ways. So constructed things have real impacts. Remember that the social determinants of health are not equal to the processes that shape these determinants' unequal distribution. So if you're doing prevention work using a public health model, yes, keep talking to people about the social determinants of health, but be real careful with the way you do. I want you to pull back and think a little bit about the processes that shaped those determinants' unequal distribution, and make sure that when you talk about them, that you're keeping people focused on the root causes of that unequal distribution so that we know where to aim our interventions. Simply accommodating people in systems that were never designed for their survival is inherently inequitable. For me, after reading this article, the one thing that really sat with me, that stayed with me, was equitable access to flawed, broken, or inequitable systems isn't true equity. And I want to say that again. Equal or equitable access to flawed, broken, or inequitable systems isn't true equity. It's important work for us to be looking at how we can equalize access to our systems, to our services, to our agencies, to fair trials, like all of this work is very, very important, but that work is harm reduction, y'all. The work of trying to get people equal access is harm reduction. The work of shifting the systems or recreating the systems, being creative and brilliant and tapping into just that generative power of our imaginations to envision something that could be different and better, that's where the real systems work happens. It's not to say we shouldn't be doing systemic harm reduction every day when we clock in. We just need to know that there's a bigger prize we have our eye on, and that's creating systems and services that are equitable and that do take care of people and that are supported by their cultures and have buy-in from communities. I want to remind you all, I'm going to pause actually for a minute. I'm going to go back and look at the chat box before I keep going, because the chat box has been brilliant. Y'all are amazing. Thank you very much for bringing your full selves to this. Let's see. So someone mentioned in terms of challenges where we see some of this play out in our systems, over-representation of white people as professionals in the advocacy field. Absolutely. That is something that I sit with a whole lot as a white person in this field, and trying to think of how I can use my position and my privilege to turn people's eyes in different directions. Someone brought up lack of understanding within the anti-sexual violence movement, that it was started by Black women, lack of understanding and recognition. A minimum wage that hasn't moved in a decade or more. Someone put in a quote that said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." Thank you for sharing that quote. And then I'm seeing lots of preach and yes and agreement in the chat box, and also someone mentioning white leaders of agencies serving primarily people of color. I want to just throw this out there. Not all funders look with a racial lens at grant applications, but if you are submitting an application for a grant that serves a specific population, and I'm going to say because of the focus of this webinar, let's say you're putting out an application for grants to fund services and outreach to provide better services to African Americans in your community. And that's what you're wanting to do. Those funders, if they're smart, the first thing they're going to do is go to your agency's website and look and see staff pictures for your leadership, not just your case managers. Case managers are super important, but we want to see leadership and your board. And if you have nothing but white faces looking back at them, you might not be ready to administer that grant that is there to support other people. That grant might be better administered through an agency that has done their internal work. So think about that. Someone in the comments says, always think of Tupac as well. We got money for wars, but we can't feed the poor. Right, we put our money with what we prioritize. That's the case for like individual and personal and family budgeting, and that's the case as a country. We put our money for whatever we prioritize. All right, we'll go on to the next slide. So if at this moment you are having a moment where you're hearing all of this and you're like, yes, I agree, and also I can't fix structural racism by myself, you're not alone. It's big. Sometimes I wake up and feel a little bit immobilized by thinking about how big some of the real root causes behind what we're doing are and how big they feel to me. Structural groundwater change is not low-hanging fruit. And a lot of times when we want to write a grant application, because this is how our system is set up, we write a grant application in very specific ways. We want to show concrete outcomes. You can't write a grant application to end racism in the U.S. It's not low-hanging fruit, right? We're not going to be able to write a project that's going to fix this. We can write projects that impact it and that take it into consideration and that work to mitigate its impact, and that's super important. But it's not low-hanging fruit. So I want to encourage you to start small. And one of the ways you can start small is by revisiting that question about who are your community partners, who are your stakeholders, who are you accountable to. For me, think about who is already in your community doing this work that's maybe underfunded, maybe doesn't have the level of support or name recognition you do. Who are those community partners, and how can you work with them? Who are you ultimately accountable to? And does that answer to who you're accountable to, does that include people in your community who've been marginalized by society, who maybe are living under the weight of having their survival criminalized? Who are you accountable to? Who are you trying to support? Which then would bring us to just some concrete suggestions. What can we do? And I'm going to throw some ideas out there, and then I'm going to open it up to y'all in the chat. And so we'll start discussing. We can't fix the big problem by ourselves. We're all individuals, even our agencies. I don't know what agency you're with. Maybe they're very well funded, but you're probably still not going to be able to fix it by yourself, no matter how well funded you are. So what can we do? Think about what are some of the systems we do our work in. So maybe throw that in the chat box. Who wants to share some of the systems that we work with by virtue of the work that we're doing? While y'all are throwing that in there, I see someone mentioning you don't have staff photos or names on the website. You don't need to rethink that. That's fine. I'm just saying if I do go and I have beaming white ladies smiling at me, then I'm going to question, that's going to be a sign to me that I'm going to kind of question who they're prioritizing. But let's see. Yeah, and I understand those of you that don't have pictures up. I'm not saying you all should. I'm just saying that if they do go and look and it's nothing but, especially if it's nothing but white men, that there might be some question about what kind of work you're doing and how. So some of the systems that we might be working in: criminal justice and law enforcement, higher education, police, hospitals, social services, welfare, child protective services, healthcare, colleges and universities, trying to focus more on HBCUs. That's good work. I know NC CASA, my coworker Tracy Wright has been doing some amazing work with HBCUs in North Carolina. Housing, employment assistance programs, parenting centers, law enforcement, mental health providers, medical systems, universities, other victim service agencies, police, DVSV advocates embedded in police departments, which of course has its benefits, but also means we're collaborating with abusers in a rotten system. That's in the chat box. Courts, unemployment, SNAP, housing authority, transportation, abuse services. There are so many comments here. I'm going to encourage, I'm going to read the ones that say they're to all panelists and encourage y'all to read the chat box for the ones that are going to attendees too. Prosecution of women and other victims for defending themselves. Law enforcement, mental health, DSS, health clinics. So these are some of the systems we do our work in. So think about those systems as you're leaving this webinar and moving forward. Think about them. How do we work in those systems? And how can we incorporate systems change and cultural shifts into our work? Some examples that came up for me are providing and supporting community-based interventions for violence. That's one way to do systems change. There are a lot of places where impacted communities are doing far more amazing work. If you think about an impacted community for whom calling police does not in this moment feel safe, given our current system, they are coming up with amazing responses to violence in their community. how can you support them? So I'm thinking specifically, I did a training at one point. Those of you who do prevention work in sexual violence are probably familiar with the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. And I went to like a 5 Ds of community de-escalation training by BYP 100, where they used the 5 Ds and they expanded it and did role plays and an amazing training where they were teaching us how to use those 5 Ds to respond not just to sexual and partner violence, but also to state violence. So giving us examples like you are walking down the street and suddenly you see a black man run who says, "Help me quick, they're coming after me," and then the police come around the corner and they're pinning him down in a way that you know, he's not resisting and you're seeing something happen that looks like police violence. How do you respond using the 5 Ds, right? So giving you trainings on how to do community-based intervention. There's a book called The Revolution Starts at Home, Confronting Intimate Partner Violence in Activist Communities, I think is the full title. But it has a chapter in it written by, I think, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, talking about Ubuntu and the work that Ubuntu did, where they had their own almost like a system of an informal hotline for Black women in their community who were experiencing partner violence, to where they kind of had a plan, they had a system, they knew how they were going to respond. Someone reached out to one of the people in the phone tree who had a partner who was starting to escalate, and all of a sudden you've got 6 other women at your house who just come on in, help themselves sit down. One of them's trying to distract, you know, they're all surrounding the survivor. They're coming up with strategies that don't rely on some of the systems that are harmful. Mutual aid funds are another example of supporting community-based interventions. So those of you who've ever tried to find shelter or housing, and I'm thinking specifically of trans women or trans women of color, you know that shelters aren't an ideal option, because even if you have staff who are trying to do the right things and have training, if those staff are not intervening on bullying between clients, bullying, harassment, and transphobic violence between clients, then that shelter is not a safe space. So a lot of times the only way that they can be safe is in a single unit. A lot of times scattered site housing is a better model, or providing some funding for hotels. And there's not always funds for that. And so mutual aid funds will actually just crowdsource from the community. A lot of them, they don't have a nonprofit status. They aren't able to raise money on a nonprofit donation basis, but they regularly share the donating link and rally support in their communities. I know my local queer community where I live has some pretty solid mutual aid work happening, and a lot of that is being funded by white LGBTQ people who recognize that they have privilege and just regularly every month dump money into this fund to try to make sure that people who need help have access to it. So think about, what are the community-based interventions that maybe aren't even operating in a nonprofit model that we're used to? What are they doing, and how can we connect survivors to those if that's what they want? Because maybe you're not what they want. Maybe you're not the best solution for that survivor in that moment. How can we uplift their work? How can we support them? Is there ways we can help fund some of the work that they're doing within the scope of what we do? Because part of being the expert doesn't mean you know everything or you can do everything. It means you can connect people to what they need in that moment. And sometimes that means setting your ego aside and recognizing that's not you. And again, providing and supporting alternatives and empower and follow the lead of impacted communities. You don't need to be writing a grant for how to serve an impacted community unless you've got that impacted community having people contribute to the development of that grant and the leadership on that grant. So work with and empower and follow the lead of impacted communities. Another thing I would say is maybe offering this kind of training, what we just did on this webinar. Find some people to come into your neighborhood and in your communities and into your agencies and continue this dialogue and keep this training going so y'all can stay creative and fresh. I'm one person and I'm not that great, and I can pull some of these ideas together, but if you get on the ground with people in your community and start really learning what's happening, you're going to learn a whole lot more than I could share with you. So what else? What are some other concrete suggestions? I'm going to go look in the chat box and see if there's any there. But what are some concrete suggestions that y'all might have for doing some of this system shift within your community and within your agency? And alternatively, if any of you know of some really creative work being done in your community to kind of empower community-based solutions that maybe lean a little less heavily into systems, or creative ways where people are challenging the way the systems have always operated, feel free to share some examples. So someone says collaboration across agencies serving particular communities. That's a great idea. So I'm thinking if there's already an agency that's doing anti-racism work in your community, or even a loose group of organizers doing anti-racism work, and you're wanting to write that grant using your agency's nonprofit status to fund services for Black survivors, for example, then reach out to that group of organizers and see if they want to collaborate. How can you leverage some of your organizational privilege to work with them, right? So someone mentioned doing the inward work, checking your, so I can say that inward work is both yourself on your own. Are you doing your work to check your biases? Because you've got them. No matter who you are, you've got the biases. And if you are someone who lives with a lot of privilege, and again, privilege doesn't mean your life hadn't been hard. It means that your life has not been hard for specific reasons related to race or other identities. So do your work. Are you checking your own bias? Are you checking your own privilege? But also organizationally doing that inward work. Taking a look at your policies, look at your intake policies, look at your criteria for staying housed. Are you low barrier? If you run a shelter, are you low barrier? Are the shelters you're sending people to low barrier? And if not, how can you advocate for change? Because I know serving on my agency's homelessness board, or my county's homelessness board, I'm on my county's homelessness board that makes decisions. A lot of times we want to do stuff that's really low barrier, and the reason we can't is because our communities and neighborhoods are throwing a fit. The neighborhoods and communities that have more privilege are doing the whole not in my backyard thing. So if you're not having access to low barrier shelter options in your community, then maybe you could partner with them on some community education to help get that community buy-in for solutions that we know work. Look at your intake, look at your employment policies. Look at your hiring practices. Someone mentioned having hard conversations and meetings with colleagues from your own org and partner agencies. That is hard. For me, I feel a lot of times like in meetings, I'm like, and webinars, how far can I push the needle? Because I know I love my job. I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to make anyone not like my agency, but sometimes we need to tell community partners, hey, this thing that you're doing, this practice that you're really in love with and excited about, I'm seeing a lot of ways it causes harm. Are you open to hearing about that so we can try to troubleshoot? Someone mentioned, let's see. Oh, I'm scrolling the wrong way, y'all. It's that kind of day. Supporting local groups with Black leadership monetarily and showing up. Give them your money. I'm going to say that over and over. I know there's restrictions because of your status as a nonprofit on what you can do. But in terms of your organization, how can you write them into your grants so that you're helping to fund the work they're doing as a community partner? Can you write them into your grants and then give them a cut of that and some continue, like, empower them with some support from your agency too? And then as individuals, you know, I work for an agency, and just because my agency doesn't make donations doesn't mean that I don't every month to try to support some of these initiatives and keep them going. Someone shared a link from Showing Up for Racial Justice on white supremacy culture characteristics and says, this has been helpful to us in evaluating our internal policies and practices. Yes, that is something to where, as someone who is a little bit type A and very much a perfectionist, I am often getting reminded by my incredible mentors and supervisors and coworkers that sometimes those are white supremacy practices that I need to be working on. So take a look at your expectations and what you consider professional in your workplace, and then look at the ways those might be perpetuating white supremacy and making it hard for the impacted people we want to be working with to hold positions in our agencies. Someone brought up researching and acknowledging the harm our government institutions have harmed communities we serve, trainings on racial health equity that includes structural racism and cultural humility. Someone mentioned naming the racism in the services and practices that you see. Someone mentioned, here's a question, how do we advocate for greater diversity in hiring processes? We have these conversations frequently in my agency, but the actual outcomes are underwhelming. It feels like the conversations aren't doing enough. So if someone has some suggestions around hiring that you want to throw into the chat box, I'm going to keep scrolling through the chat, but maybe I'll get to some suggestions or maybe a resource that some of y'all think. There are a lot of different suggestions I've heard, such as reviewing resumes without any identifying information, like if someone's name, having the names blacked out as you're reviewing resumes, if someone, having the name of the college they went to, if they include education, blacked out, so that we're not, factoring that as heavily, that kind of school they went to, into the hiring process. Also not requiring a college education for everything. You don't need a college education for every position in this work, and sometimes people who've been doing it for years as a grassroots organizer may know more than you do if you've got that fancy degree. Let's see, someone mentioned I get calls for job references and have begun questioning the agencies themselves on their current efforts to dismantle internal oppressive systems. Someone says, we did a conference entitled Black Love Matters, a huge for Southwest Virginia. We had police officers, Black therapists, reps from DV and SA agencies, and others. We examined cultural considerations in sexual assault and domestic violence work. I love that. And again, those of you who are doing sexual assault, domestic violence work need to be doing anti-racist work, and NC CASA has never been secretive about the fact that we have an anti-oppression lens, but we sometimes get challenged where people are like, why are you talking about race all the time? You're the sexual violence agency. But we talk about race because we have to if we want to end sexual violence, because the history of sexual violence, like we talked about earlier, is so intertwined. You can't do SADV work effectively without talking about race. Someone mentions talking about the impact of your practices on different populations. Name the disparities by race. Someone says establishment of a wellness fund to provide easier access and distribution of funds to community programming. Someone says crucial conversations, bringing together community members from Black community with law enforcement for safe conversations. That one, I can imagine that is a tricky thing to facilitate, and trying to make sure you've got the right people at the table with the right mindset is tricky. Someone says, as a privileged white woman, it's me, I'm the one who needs to push this conversation in some of these settings because I have a lot less to lose. And that's one of those where I'm just going to name that as a white person doing this work, it's sometimes hard for me to navigate, because on the one hand, I'm aware that because of racism, I can get away with saying things that a colleague of color could not get away with saying in a group meeting. So I feel an extra push to be courageous in those moments and to speak that and name it, even though it makes me, everybody feels uncomfortable around conflict sometimes. And at the same time, I don't want to speak over anyone. So I don't know if anyone else has had that experience, but that's a tricky balance that we have to learn to hold a little bit gracefully to make sure that we're speaking up because we know we can say the thing and get less pushback and less impact on our career just because of racism. And at the same time, we don't want to speak over anybody. So how do you make sure that what you're saying is where you need it? Erica, I see your comment and I appreciate you. And yes, that was me. Feel free to email me afterwards. I would actually love to connect with you. So someone else is saying part of the inward work is looking into the history of our own vocation and discipline. So for me, I'm trying to look into the harmful racist moves made by the social work field in the past so that I can recognize if and when they are happening again today. Thank you for naming that. I know that my Twitter feed is a lot of social media, or a lot of social workers, and I am hearing them feel very excited about the idea of moving some funding that's been used to have police respond to things like mental health crises and family conflict over into social workers. But I've also seen a lot of social workers doing a really good job of naming that social work itself has a lot of racism in these histories, especially around that piece we talked about earlier about civilizing norms and how that impacts not just how we criminalize things, but also what do we think someone needs, right? So those racist norms in the early social work field and in the early anti-trafficking movement, now that I'm thinking about it, Those norms around what is civilized impacted who we decided we wanted to help and empower, who we decided we needed to rescue and save, and who we decided we needed to criminalize and eject from our culture. So those norms not only impacted criminalization, they also impacted the framing of how we even understand what the purpose of helping professions are. Someone says this work has to start with leadership. We need to honor lived experience. We have someone else who's talking about hating the glorification of degrees. Here's someone saying, I struggle balancing accountability to communities of color with not asking those communities to do the work that I need to do. Thank you for naming that. That is another thing where you don't want to reach out to that community of color and say, tell us what to do and how to do it. I know we only have a few minutes left in the webinar, and so those of you, if you need to duck out early, I'm going to kind of work through some of these things in the chat box. We might run just a little bit late. But if you do have to leave early, feel free to email me for the last couple of slides, which is basically just a self-care thing. And my contact info, which is Christy, C-H-R-I-S-T-Y @nccasa.org. I see with not asking them to do the work for you while still being accountable to them. That's a tricky balance. That's definitely not a 101 skill, but definitely seek out resources and information and training on your own. There are people who are hired to come and do, who as their work will come in and do racial equity work with you in your organization that will then help you build the foundation that you need to build to start reaching out to these communities with more integrity and balance. Someone says, as a white person advocating among a lot of white people, challenging them or inviting them to move into that discomfort, bringing to the forefront of this conversation that discomfort is not the same as being unsafe. Say it again, discomfort is not the same as being unsafe. There's an event Thursday on this topic of making sure social workers don't just become the new police, and there's a link in the chat box. And someone mentions to equate discomfort as a lack of safety is actually part of the racism. And I'm reminded of whatever the Egg McMuffin thing was where, you know, someone posted a sad video because their Egg McMuffin was a few minutes late and they were pretty sure it's because they were wearing a uniform that looked like a cop uniform. And, you know, that's not the same. You know, you getting your Egg McMuffin late is not the same as you experiencing threat to your actual life and body on an everyday basis. And someone asked, can we get the link again for making sure, oh, you're right, that link did just go, thank you, that link did just go to panelists. So I'm going to share that in the chat box. Making sure social workers don't become the new police. So that did go out to everybody. And we actually are getting near the end. More things we can do. What can we, and y'all have brought these up in the chat box already, so I'm going to blow through this slide. What can we do in our own agencies to make sure we're ready to engage in this work? And that can include racial equity training for all staff. Not a 90-minute training. Just because you bring somebody in for 90 minutes to talk to you about race does not mean you're doing internal racial equity work. It means you paid somebody for 90 minutes. You need to get someone who's going to engage with you on an ongoing basis, full-day trainings, two-day trainings, and then ongoing follow-up, someone who you can pay to consult with you on your internal policies. Implicit bias training for all staff. And again, this is not a one-hour professional development issue. This is an ongoing commitment. And someone mentions in the chat box, equity training is different from diversity and inclusion training. Thank you for naming that. Checking our workplace policies. And I'm not going to say what else. We've been talking about that in the chat box for the last few minutes. So in the couple of minutes that we have left, do any of y'all have any questions that you wanted to throw out? And again, I might not have time to answer them, but we can leave the chat box open for some discussion at the close of the webinar if y'all have any last minute things to share with each other. And you can always email me. We have talked a lot about heavy stuff. We have talked a lot about things that may feel kind of overwhelming because none of these are easy solutions. And all of these things are things that impact us individually in different ways and have to do with trauma. So take just a moment, whether you're someone who is a yoga master or someone who accidentally lands in yoga poses when you fall out of bed because you're awesome. Either way, just take a minute and stretch. And notice how your body takes up space and how it feels in your body right now. What's the landscape? Where do you feel tension? Where do you feel ease? And move for a minute however feels good. And maybe when you get off this webinar, go get yourself a nice cup of your favorite yummy beverage and maybe go for a walk, get a little bit of fresh air if the weather's nice where you are. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. Don't use the phone number. We're all working remotely. You'll just get my voicemail, which I won't hear for a while. But you can email me, Christy@nccasa.org. I love hearing from people and having these conversations as much as my capacity allows, and look forward to the opportunity to connect with you. Thanks so much, y'all. I'm going to look in the chat box. And we will be sending out a PDF. I'm going to read through these last few questions before we end the webinar. So Gabriella, if you'll leave it open long enough for me to scroll through the question box, even though we're not going to really get a whole lot of time to address them right now. Email me if y'all have any questions, and thanks for joining.
So there is a question on if we will post this recording. We will be posting this recording up on our YouTube channel.
For real this time?
I really hope so. If Zoom will.
We thought that the last one was recording and then we ended the webinar and it wasn't there. So I really hope this one recorded, because y'all were amazing. This chat box was amazing, and that's because of each of you.
And you want me to keep the chat box?
And I think I'm good. I can download the chat, and if anyone has a direct question, you can email me. All right?
Okay. Cool.
Y'all have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.